Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this webinar, Opportunities and Pitfalls from Legalizing Drugs. And of course, this is going to be about lessons from California. I'm Rafael Fernández de Castro. I'm the director of the Center for U.S.-Mexican Studies, and I welcome you all to this webinar again on drugs. We have wonderful panelists. Of course, we have two panelists from California. One that is based in Washington, D.C., but I will say she's a global citizen, and I will introduce her, and we have two Mexicans here. We have with us Emilio Camacho, who is the Deputy City Attorney of Sacramento, the capital of California, and in his desk, I mean, he's overseen everything regarding cannabis. So thank you, Emilio, for being with us and for being such a good friend of the Center for U.S.-Mexican Relations. We also have from California, Josh Veal. He's for Lumpy Flowers. He's in the business of cannabis in California. He has been in the business for over 20 years. He was in medical marijuana, and now he's in these new times in which we have recreational marijuana. And thank you, Josh. We know that we have been a victim of these fires, so we truly appreciate that you participate with us. We also have Vanda Felbab-Brown for Brookings Institution. I mean, she's an authority on drugs, on violence in the world. Thank you, Vanda, for being such a good friend. And of course, I appreciate your, I would say, global vision. No one like you has this global vision, and you've been focusing on Mexico for the last 2 decades. So this is wonderful because you bring a lot of lessons to Mexico. And then we have Catalina Pérez-Correa, professor at CIDE, and we all know, I mean, she's very well known because she's been in these debates about legalizing cannabis in Mexico, and of course, she's an expert on Mexican security. And we have Tania Ramírez from México, Unido, Contra la Delincuencia. Thank you, Tania, for agreeing with us. I mean, you're in charge of the drug policy program of your organization. And of course, we know that you're one of the main advocates of this legalization of cannabis in Mexico. So let me tell you to everybody, I mean, we want to do this with a lot of questions. We want to make this a dialogue with everybody listening to us. So please, if you have questions, just use the Q&A button and write your questions. Our panelists will be able to answer to you in a written form. And of course, I will select some of the questions and we will answer your questions. So let's try to do this as much as a dialogue as we can. So let me start with Tania Ramírez. Tania, how's the debate now in Mexico about legalization of cannabis? And if you could give us a sense about what is the debate in Congress and what is the political debate? I mean, how you see the Andrés Manuel administration willing to do this or not? Because let's face it, we have nowadays a very powerful presidency.
Yes. Hello, everybody, and thank you for inviting me. I'm so glad to be part of this panel with these amazing colleagues. Rafael, as you may know, due to the order of the Mexican Supreme Court, the Mexican Congress shall approve a new cannabis framework before the end of this year. In this way, Mexico can become the third regulated cannabis market for personal use at a national level, along with Canada and Uruguay. But first of all, I want to emphasize that this reform does not provide from the political will of politics or the president or authorities, but it comes from a mandatory judicial decision that is consequence of the work developed by civil society years and years ago. So in 2012, in light of the horrible consequences of the prohibitory regime, we decided in MUCD to start a strategic litigation way in order to promote these changes from the judiciary. So in 2012, through the Amparo Smart, a case before the courts, we started to promote this petition. And finally, in 2015, we obtained the first ruling in the Supreme Court. And basically, for the first time ever, the Mexican Supreme Court held that ban on recreational use of cannabis was unconstitutional on the basis of the right of free development of personality. So this decision allowed or provide authorization to a group of only 4 people, all of them members of MUCD's board, to use cannabis for personal uses and all the activities related to, such as growth, transportation, process, possession, and so on. Nevertheless, that decision did not imply a general legalization. According to Mexican law, we needed 5 rulings in the same vein in order to create something that we call jurisprudencia, in order to achieve this threshold. We continue with the strategic litigation plan, and finally in 2018, November 2018, we obtained in the Supreme Court the 5th ruling. And what are the consequences of this jurisprudencia? Basically, it creates a precedent for other courts, or a precedent that all the courts, all the Mexican courts shall follow, but also it creates general effects, what we call a declaratoria general de inconstitucionalidad. It's basically a general unconstitutional declaration. And it means that the Supreme Court ordered at the beginning of 2019 to the Congress that they shall change the law and approve a new regulatory framework. So basically, that's where we are. The first deadline that the Supreme Court provided to the Congress was on October 2019. Nevertheless, this deadline changed twice due to delays in the Congress and due to the COVID situation. So the new deadline is now in December 15 of this year. The first draft of this bill was already approved within the commissions of the Senate last February, and we are really worried about it because we strongly believe that this model proposed in that bill is not accurate to the Mexico necessities and to the Mexico priorities and requirements, and also about what are the motivations to regulate cannabis in Mexico. So in the first place, we should follow a framework that comply with social justice, human rights, public health, and security. Nevertheless, this first draft of the bill that was approved and has to be approved also by the Senate during September and then to the Chamber of Deputies contained 3 big categories of mistakes or faults that we found. And I'm going to be very brief. But the first one is that still criminalizing drug possession and minor drug crimes. So it does not include an effective decriminalization scheme. The second thing that is really terrible for us is that it does not create, it creates barriers, huge barriers for local and small participants of the markets. And the third one is this bill contains overregulation and huge requirements that seems to be designed for big industries. So that's where we are, and we are following this discussion, but basically this is the model proposed or chosen by the Senate rather than other proposals that we drafted.
Thank you, Tania. This is very good. We come back to you. This is a wonderful panorama where things are. Emilio, let me come to you. I mean, you're in Sacramento and you've overseen this legalization of cannabis. Give us a sense. I mean, this was approved in 2016. cannabis for recreational use. But of course, cannabis has been allowed in California more than a decade for medical use. I mean, where is California now? Is all California, I mean, we have all cannabis being legalized, or where things are, Emilio?
Yeah, just for background, and I'd like to make sure that Josh is able to supplement here, since he's actually in the business of cannabis and has had to go through our, many changes. The way I like to explain California, right, is, for a long time, we've been building the fire truck on the way to the fire, right? I mean, we've just kind of been creating it as we go. It starts in 1996 when basically marijuana and cannabis is legalized for medicinal purposes. But in reality, if we are frank, it was really a big loophole for recreational, right? It allowed for doctors to provide you a recommendation, and that recommendation, it could be something as vague as back pain, or a migraine or something like that, right? So a lot of people would just come in with their card, but that only allowed a defense for criminal prosecution, right? It didn't really necessarily deal with a business of cannabis, right? You could grow it yourself for your own purpose, and then they started to create what are called collectives, and I'm not going to go into that because that would be a whole webinar on its own. But it was basically people pulling themselves together with many licenses, and then they could produce a larger crop or shield. And then the transactions would happen like that, even though they weren't necessarily, it wasn't for sale or anything like that. So after many, several decades of really just being just a real loophole, then the voters, folks organized, and then they decided to put a ballot initiative, basically skip the legislature and the governor, just take it to the voters. And it passed in 2016, and it gave 2 years for the state and the local governments to, get their act together and, do regulations and regulatory programs and frameworks. And so then we get to 2018, and that's when folks were able to technically open the doors and get their permits. Now, and Josh can talk a little bit more about this, but that was, it's been challenging. And, but now we have a lot of operators that are able to get these licenses. And, we're still trying to make sure that folks comply with the issues that Californians care about. And we're still finding and learning a lot of new things. So that's kind of how we got to where we are now. And Sacramento is the fifth or sixth largest city in the state. So, we have a lot to deal with and a lot to say, but, I'll save it for the next questions.
Thank you, Emilio. This is very good. Catalina, I wonder if you want to complement Tania. I mean, where do you see things, the debate is now in Mexico, how feasible you see that we will legalize cannabis this year, according to the Supreme Court? And what do you think that are going to be the most important consequences for the violence in Mexico? Because that's what is really affecting us badly.
So yes, thank you, Rafael, and also thank you for the invitation. And yes, I think it's an interesting question about whether this is going to happen. I think COVID is going to make it hard for legislation to go through, especially as Tania was saying, we don't want the legislation that has been proposed because it basically excludes the farmers who have been traditionally growing cannabis. And so it's not a good legislation. It's basically driven towards pharmaceutical interests without placing an emphasis on social justice, which is what Mexico really needs. So if this legislation actually passes, what we're going to have is a bunch of pharmaceuticals or big companies having their interests put forward and excluding the local farmers and markets. I think another question which is very important is the question about violence and cannabis, which is something that we've been talking about these past days. And it has been said that regulating cannabis could help reduce violence. this could be the case as part of the illegal drug market thrives around illegal cannabis. But, you know, violence is a very complex issue, and illegal cannabis is only a part of that big puzzle. So regulating cannabis, you know, would not necessarily address that violence, but it could reduce a different type of violence, which is the one that the state exercises, especially against certain populations in Mexico. And it could also be helpful because it frees institutional resources that are today used for combating cannabis. And I just want to, you know, very quickly give some data out. Today, simple possession, which is possession without the intent to sell, represents around 60 to 65% of open investigations for drug crimes in the country. While sale or supply only comprises around 1.7% or 2% of local investigations. So what we really see is the criminal justice system around drug issues is basically geared toward very, very petty or small scale drug traffickers or against users. So, and most of these cases involve cannabis. So really, you know, what we have in Mexico is a drug policy that either targets kingpins, which generates a lot of violence, and, you know, we can talk about that later. But on the other hand, the bulk of the policy is geared toward targeting small-scale dealers or users. So we do know that regulating cannabis could help reduce the violence and all the problems that it generates around the policy and the problems that it generates. And you know, but at the same time, there are other many powerful reasons other than violence why cannabis should be regulated. You know, harm reduction, the protection of rights, reduction of use for minors, income of the state through taxes, among others. However, in terms of violence, we would really need to talk about regulating the whole illegal market of drugs and not just cannabis.
Thank you, Catalina. This is very good. Let's go to Josh. Josh, you've been in the business. So, I mean, what is your take on this? I mean, how California is doing and how you feel about the new regulations? Is the business going well during this COVID-19?
At this point, I'd say, you know, it's starting to go well. But like Emilio said, there's a big gap. When Prop 64 came out, I think people that were really in the industry that were using the loophole that he talks about and the legal licensing authority boards weren't ready for Prop 64. And it kind of thrusted everybody into a position where, you know, you're on this stage, how are you going to do this? And how are two people that basically have been trying to avoid each other for all these years going to work together to better suit the community overall and put their biases aside on both sides. I think that, you know, like she was just saying, you know, with the legalization of it, I think that a lot of the times people get into the fact of big pharma's the way to go, big corporate's the way to go versus the farmers that have actually been in it since day one. And I think that bridging that gap is going to be a big importance to make sure that everything continues to run smoothly. But in the most part, I'd say California's done a pretty good job for as many years as they've been doing it. And, you know, we just need to continue to work together and both just be open-minded and honest about what issues that arise when you legalize something that's been illegal for so long. There's going to be issues that are going to have to come up and they're going to have to be discussed. And I think fair regulation and laws is what's really going to have to, you know, come around, and taxes are a whole nother issue. But for the most part, I'd say here in Sacramento, I'm proud to be an owner in Sacramento. I'm glad that I think in Sacramento is one of the few cities that actually has it down in such a short time period. But that's kind of where we're at. And I think California's doing a pretty good job, but we've learned a lot over the last, you know, couple decades.
Thank you, Josh. Vanda, I mean, you will have the luxury to really look at other parts of the world. And you've been looking at the licensing of poppy in Turkey and India. Could you tell us about, I mean, what you see in other parts of the world regarding this legalization of drugs?
Well, thank you, Rafael, for the invitation, and congratulations on a very important conversation with a stellar set of panelists. So there are several analogies. The quite direct analogy is the legalization of marijuana, of cannabis in Colombia, where the issues that Catalina was speaking about are very paramount. Poor indigenous farmers, former cocaleros, or people who cultivated cannabis really struggle to compete and struggle to make any kind of effective livelihoods. So this, in comparison to large firms. The industry as such has not impressively taken off in Colombia. It's still in very initial stages, and it's really not competing effectively in terms of exports or even domestic products. But particularly small-scale farmers are struggling. So this notion that simply legalizing that or any form of legalization will benefit the cocaleros, often the poor farmers, or who bear the brunt of eradication and repression policy, often doesn't materialize. It did happen, however, in the cases of two licensing in India and Turkey. In this case, this was not marijuana, but it was poppy, that in both countries was legalized for the production of morphine, of medicinal opioids. In Turkey, this place took in the 1970s after eradication that generated massive social unrest. Turkey was a crucial ally in terms of NATO anti-Soviet efforts during Cold War. And so the US agreed to support a licensing scheme and not just agreed to support it, but also guaranteed that 80% of raw imports of the base product for opiates would be imported from Turkey and India. And this 80-20% rule was critical because in the absence, neither Turkey nor India would have been able to stay in the market. Producers of raw opiate ingredients in Australia and New Zealand developed far more competitive, far more effective combination of poppy plants that produce alkaloids that are much more appealing to pharmaceutical industry. So if this artificial restriction had not been in place, both Turkey and India would no longer be competitive, and all the farmers and industry that it employs in both countries would not be there. Now, Turkey succeeded in using the legal market to eliminate its illegal market. For a country to get an international license to grow opium poppy for the production of medical opiates, it needs to satisfy two conditions. One is that there is no leakage from the legal production into the illegal trade. Turkey succeeded in that, but adopting a method called poppy straw method that makes this diversion into heroin very difficult. The downside of the poppy straw method, however, is that it's nowhere as labor intensive as scraping of poppy for the raw gum out of which heroin is produced. So it employed many fewer people. India, on the other hand, did not adopt that same poppy straw method. There, the morphine is still produced by scraping the capsules. And along with that comes employment of greater number of people, perhaps some 80,000 in India, but also significant leakage into the illegal trade. At least a quarter, maybe a third of the scraped gum goes into the illegal market for the production of heroin. And on top of that, there continues to be significant and increasing production of illegal poppy cultivation. So illegal poppy cultivation that also feeds the heroin market, and India is experiencing a significant opioid epidemic.
Thank you, Vanda. This is very, very interesting. Emilio, you've been in, you're in touch with Mexico. I believe you were born in Mexico. Now you're American, and but you're perfectly bilingual. And what do you think the lessons from California to Mexico should be? I mean, you're someone who knows Mexico. Now you're a lawyer trained in the U.S., but you have a good sense of Mexico. I mean, what lessons would you like to share with us?
Well, you know, I like to piggyback on what
So sorry, and I wonder if Catalina and Tania afterwards, if you would like to ask a question to Emilio or to Josh, please welcome. But go ahead, Emilio.
So just to piggyback actually on what Catalina was talking about, violence. So the lessons for Mexico, I would say, are 5. If you take away anything from what I'm going to say, it's 5 things. And I actually wrote them down here. Number 1, I think you should establish clear rules and regulations. And Josh can supplement on this, I mean, from his experience. Why? Because then that creates predictability in the markets, and it also creates predictability for policymakers and for the public. And what that does is everybody knows their roles. Everybody knows what they're supposed to do, what they're not supposed to do. So 1, clear rules and regulations. Number 2, for better or worse, establish a clear path, okay, to transition illegal operators to legal, status, okay? And again, we kind of sort of did it, if we could go back all over again, we probably would do it a little bit differently, but it hasn't been a complete failure. We have, and Josh is an excellent example of what, we in Sacramento now, we want to have. We want to have more Josh Veals, right, that have complied with everything. And Josh can talk about, we actually had a legal difficulty, right, where we actually filed a lawsuit against Josh, and we were able to work through that. And, now he is what, personally, this is just me personally, not speaking on my official capacity, I would say, like a model business. So establish a clear path. Number 3, be ready and willing to modify or reconsider your approach, right? Just because you have this rule or this regulation, maybe it's not working out, right? So be always willing to reconsider. Number 4, establish, and Josh can talk a little bit about this, establish a strong enforcement program, right? And that's for 2 reasons. Number 1, if folks are doing everything right, like in California, you have to get, like Josh, for example, has to get a state license. He has to get a tax license at the state level as well. He has to get a permit for the location. He has to get a permit for the business. He's got to get a local tax permit. I mean, it could be 2 years. It could be over $1 million, right? And then in California currently, unfortunately, about 80, and maybe Josh can talk about this, about 75 to 80% still comes from the illegal market. Okay, they pay no taxes, no licensing fees. They don't have to go through the environmental review, through everything. So the reason why you want a strong enforcement program is so that, in fairness to people like Josh, who are spending all this time and money to do things right, we don't want all these guys in a house or somewhere else to be undercutting Josh. And the localities also lose tax revenue as well. And then finally, and I can't emphasize this enough, make sure that the agencies involved coordinate, talk to each other, right? Because that can be a disaster. It can be a disaster for the persons who are in business. If somebody tells you, the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. So here we feel very proud in Sacramento, and Josh can put us on blast if it's different. We coordinate actually with the state. And, there is, I won't go through all of them, but, there's 9 state agencies that could potentially touch cannabis. There's about 20 different licenses for cannabis-related businesses. In Sacramento, we have about 400, licensed businesses. In different stages, we have about 28 active dispensaries. And, so we have a lot going on. So I think those are the main lessons that I would leave Mexico and anybody listening to. And arriba Guadalajara, soy de Guadalajara, eh?
This is very good, and I will ask Vanda, Tania, and Catalina if they would like ask something to you. But let me ask Josh. Josh, Emilio is telling us that about 70–80% of the market continues to be illegal. why you decided to go and follow the regulations? Is it fair with you? Is it good business for you, Josh?
Yes, I would say one major reason is, being on the illegal side, your door can get kicked in at any given time. And if you have kids or a family, that's not the life that you want to live as a business person. But secondly, the rules and regulations that are set forth are there for a reason. Some of them don't make sense. And Emilio made a good point. I'd say the 5 things he touched on is what's major, strong, clear regulation, which we don't have from city to city. Some things are still disorganized. The state and the cities don't always communicate, so people are able to take things out the back door and do things like that, which it hurts the taxpayers like us. But I think another thing that people don't realize is California is the Napa Valley of cannabis. So everyone in the world comes here to try our cannabis. And with more legalization of states opening up, Illinois, New York, Oklahoma, I don't think people take into account how much weed comes from California to open up these new legal markets. Take Illinois, for instance. They went legal one day, 3 days later, they have dispensaries that are open. You can't grow legal marijuana in 3 days. That had to come from somewhere. And it came from California. So I think that Sacramento's done a good job with, keeping the agencies informed through who they work with, but you don't have that in every city that crossed the board. And that's a huge issue. And with the pandemic going on, and I think there were, some agencies are understaffed to begin with. It definitely is happening. In California, I'd say last year that was happening, but this year with product being as much worse as much as it is in the black market, I'd say most of the cannabis, 50% of the cannabis grown in California is probably going to other states at this point.
Thank you, Josh, for sharing this with us. I know that Catalina and Tania and Vanda, if you want to ask a question to them, but I would like also to ask a question to Catalina and to Tania, and this is about, who are the key players in Mexico? You basically mentioned that the current bill that has been approved by the Senate it has a lot of failures, a lot of shortcomings. Who are the key players there? But go ahead, Vanda. Who wants to ask? Do you have a question?
I would like to actually add something, not so much a question, but a comment to Emilio's and Josh's excellent points, and highlight one persisting illegal dimension of a lot of cannabis production in California, and that's water theft. So Emilio was explaining the large number of licenses that a legal operator will need to acquire. One of the licenses is water. In fact, just some portion of producers of cannabis in California do go through the environmental process of demonstrating that the water that they will be using for cannabis production is sourced legally, that they have a right to the water. Or many producers simply take water, surface water from rivers. So I and a set of colleagues just recently published an article in Nature Sustainability called Grand Theft Water and the Calculus and Compliance, in which we look at illegal water markets around the world. And one of the illegal water markets we look at is in California, different dimensions in California, but one is the legal production. And so even people who get legal licenses do not necessarily comply with the water legality of sourcing cannabis, which contributes immensely to drought, overuse of water, water depletion. It's not solely specific to cannabis industry. It's true about nut production, other agricultural production in California as well. But since cannabis is a very thirsty plant, it's particularly pronounced there. And enforcement is extraordinarily difficult. There are many city police officers. There are very few water police officers. So this is one dimension where enforcement is badly needed and suffering.
Well, can I add some? I would like to pose some questions to Emilio.
Go ahead, Catalina. Yes, and you too, Tania.
Okay, so I mean, I have several questions for Emilio, and one of them has to do with the criminal records. I mean, one of the points of regulating cannabis was to, you know, help people who have been historically wronged by prohibition to have their criminal records expunged. And so I know there's some cases in California. For example, I think Oakland did something to do that, but I think overall it's been very complicated. And I just wanted to see if you could talk about that a little bit. And the other is I was talking about how you know, the authorities target certain populations. And I think one of the interesting questions for the US is if prison population or the profiles of people who are arrested now have actually changed with cannabis regulation, you know, or have they followed the previous marked biases that the system had? And the last point that I wanted to make right now is something you were talking about, who are the key players? Well, I think one of them is farmers. You know, how would regulation in Mexico address farmers? We are a country that produces cannabis and poppy traditionally, although today we even have evidence of cannabis products illicitly produced in the United States, which are illegally brought into Mexico. But we would ideally want a regulation that included into this nascent illicit cannabis industry to the farmers. And I think there's some things that we can learn from California and other parts of the states. You know, and there's many questions there that are very important, at least from the Mexican part, like crop substitution, not only from the illegal to the legal market, whether it's, you know, from illegal cannabis to legal cannabis or illegal cannabis to avocados or any other illicit crops, but also from illegal to illegal. And, you know, will people who previously were in the illicit cannabis production market now, will they produce illicit poppy? And I think that's one of the questions. And the other, I think, which is interesting, is how the government will address with the new framework what to do with illicit crops. You know, today we have forced eradications of poppy and cannabis, which is a whole other issue which we can talk about, but I think that has to be addressed in any regulation that we pass.
Tania, would you like to say something, to add something? Go ahead, please.
Yes, I would like to. First of all, I would like to, following your question, Rafael, we have conducted two publications recently about the Canadian and the US jurisdictions markets. And one of the main lessons I learned from that jurisdictions, and it has to do with your question, about who are the key actors, is that producers from the US regulated jurisdictions and Canada and other markets have been able to profit heavily from the new industry, which has in turn allowed them to position themselves to capture or at least to intervene in the developing international cannabis markets and even shaping new markets in the global south, such as Mexico. So we have like a lot of actors involving in the creation of this model, not only regarding cannabis for recreational purposes, but also medicinal cannabis. So it is important to say that the influence and the relevance that these actors are taking in other jurisdictions. So this is a huge concern about that the legal reform, which should have achieved wider social justice goals, may create new inequalities rather to solve them. And talking about California is very interesting because I totally agree with the key suggestions of Emilio. Basically, we are promoting a Mexican model which could be complete, inclusive, cautious, balanced, accessible. But one of the main difference and one of my main concerns, for example, was that you mentioned like strong enforcement agency and coordination. And here we have like a very weak regulatory agencies that are very feasible to being captured by big corporations and so on, not only regarding cannabis, but also talking about other markets. So this is one of our main concerns. And the other one has to do with, Catalina mentioned it, but it's very interesting to know about the social equity measures, such as money assistance for social equity programs on application process for licensing, technical assistance implemented in California. I don't know if you, Emilio, can go on talking about it. And also, why do California choose the criminal record sealing rather than criminal record like dismiss or expungement? I think it's different, and the difference is like a key in our next model. Thank you.
That's a lot of questions.
Plenty of things
That's a lot of questions. I wrote some stuff down, so feel free to follow up if I don't quite get them. But okay, so I like to do this in two parts. I like to give you the sort of theoretical answer, but then I want Josh to jump in because I think he's got a lot to say on this. Josh, if I may abuse your presence here and make sure that you can get. So let me just tell you the theoretical, right? The armchair lawyer perspective, right? So what Catalina's talking about is a very important concept that we here in the US and in California call equity, okay? That's the umbrella term, equity. And I have some good news and some bad news, right? The good news is that Mexico is better positioned to deal with that because here we have 50 different states with 50 different set of rules. And like Josh was saying, in California, we have about 490 plus cities, and we have about 58 counties. So you could have hundreds of regulatory frameworks that are completely different. In Mexico, because everything is so centralized, federalized, technically you could just have one regulatory framework for the entire country. So that's good. That's something that probably somebody like Josh would love, right? It's just one set of rules for everything. You don't have to be guessing. If you're going into, Josh is in Sacramento, well, now I want to be in business in, Fresno. Then he has to hire a legal team and all this and to analyze what the requirements are there, right? So that's the good news. The bad news is that equity is very hard. The reason why equity is very hard is because you're essentially trying to right the wrongs of the past. And as we know, in our history here, U.S. history, obviously, we African Americans have a very unique history as far as the criminalization of the government and people using different laws to criminalize and so on and so forth. Again, that could be a webinar on its own. But the fact, nobody would deny that it has disproportionately affected specific groups, particularly African Americans, right? And so Prop 64, which is the proposition that basically legalized, it had an equity component. That gets me to what your questions. We actually do expungements, and maybe Josh can talk a little bit more about that. And the gist for that is, well, if somebody went to jail for 10 years, the same conduct now can make somebody a millionaire. That just seems wrong, right? And same thing, right? In order for you to be able to apply for a state license, you have to have a clean record. And so you have to have some sort of way to clear that record, that violation, or at least nullify it so that it doesn't affect your ability to come in and get into the legal market. The second thing is prison populations. I can tell you that sentences got reduced. I can tell you that people were, released from prisons. Obviously, it's unfortunately on a case-by-case basis. And, here courts are countywide. I explained that we have 58 counties, and, so it's a complex system, not a perfect system, but we've been doing that. And then another aspect of equity has been, well, even if, you get that record expunged, even if, you're out of jail now and you have a shot, or even if you're just part of a community and you're low income, you have, you have none of those issues. The fact is that, and Josh can speak more about this, it takes, I've heard, probably like 2 to $500,000 to enter into this business sometimes, right? That's just the startup costs. That doesn't include you actually making money. And so even if you want to do this, right, obviously that in and of itself just basically shuts the door on most of the population, most of the people, and opens the door wide open for folks who have money and or big businesses and corporations. So what localities have been doing, and the state also has been doing, is they've been allocating money to do equity programs in Sacramento. And Josh also can speak to this because he's part of our equity program. We have the core program that basically provides a bunch of support to folks from, you know, even knowing that, you know, the types of permits you need to, you know, things like that. And we are just in the process of actually awarding a bunch of grants. We just got money. I think we have about $5 million, I think, that we're going to be awarding for people to be able to use. And obviously we're trying to make decisions on what to award, what to not. And I'm not responsible for that, but you know, that's the city council and the mayor and all that. But all which is to say is that we acknowledge that people need, you know, support addressing the wrongs of the past. People need technical support. People need financial and credit support, and people need a lot of you know, just ways of being supported. Josh, I don't know if we want to supplement with actual examples.
Yeah, as far as social equity goes, we definitely have that in California, but like Emilio said, it varies from city to city, from state to state. But it is something that needs to be in place, especially for Mexico with the farmers that you guys speak of, the small producers. But even that being said, I think our major problem in California is that, like Emilio said, if you weren't directly affected by it, but you grew up in a neighborhood that's a lower income zip code, you qualify for certain core applicants. And I think that for the first year or two rolling out your social equity, it should be limited to people that have either directly been affected from a criminal standpoint, or that they can show that they've been in the industry. And like Emilio said, they deserve one of those tickets that says, hey, we're gonna allow you to go from illegal to the legal market and help you along the way. But I think that the social equity is definitely huge. California, I think only 4% of the owners are actually Black owned. So in California, I think it's got a different layout than what Mexico's problems are going to have, but you're still going to have the same issue as the people that really deserve that social equity. You need to make sure those are the ones that are actually getting it. For people like me, it's helped me actually get to where I need to be now, but I had a brand before we started. But like Emilio said, to get in this market now in California, for the smallest entry, you're looking at $100,000, even if they waive all of your permit costs, your you know, all of your fees that come with that. You still have your taxes to pay. You still got to wait. You know, cannabis isn't getting the market today and it pays you tomorrow. It's a 4 to 6 month turnaround on your first income, which may not even be profit. So we definitely have social equity. It's definitely moving in the right direction. You know, but we definitely need to refine it as we go. And I think that they need to start tailoring it to people that actually, you know, deserve the actual help versus allowing people that were grown up in certain neighborhoods to apply for grants and loans that I don't think that they're actually entitled to because they weren't really actually in the industry before it actually started.
If I may add one last thing, Rafael, obviously the big elephant in the room, right? Mexico has to deal with, and I can say this because I was born in Mexico. I migrated when I was 16 years old. So I, you know, I lived there half of my life. Corruption, that's the big elephant in the room, right? Because here in the U.S., you know, I mean, I'm not gonna say we're perfect, but you don't have, you know, blatant corruption, and it's rare. It's rare that you have corruption. It's rare that you have, you know, somebody on video taking a suitcase full of money and things like that, right? And even if you do, it gets dealt with pretty quickly, and those people end up in jail. I mean, I'm not saying it doesn't happen, but it's the exception rather than the rule. And in Mexico, I mean, if you know, we've been following even the declarations of Mr. Lozoya and all that, and we don't get into that, right? But We just need to address the elephant in the room that when you have a potential huge market now, that's ripe for corruption, right? So, and I don't have answers for that because that's not something we here in Sacramento, me and my office think about on a daily basis because it's really not an issue. It's more of a surprising thing if it happens. But over there, I think you should have to take that into account. So.
Thank you, Emilio. Just let me react because I will say that you're right. I mean, it's corruption in the U.S. is not across the board, but unfortunately, in the last few years, the U.S. is resembling Mexico and Latin America in many ways, and I believe one of those will be corruption. I see corruption going on in the U.S. as it didn't happen before, but this is about cannabis. And Vanda, the U.S. is in the midst of an opioid crisis, and this has to do with regulated drugs and how that's affected Mexico and the drug market in Mexico, because that's part of the entire U.S.-Mexico security scenario. And then we have quite a few questions. One of them is how much should the state be involved? How much we push back at the local level? And I will read you some questions, but why don't you answer us, Vanda, and then I'll start reading questions from the people participating in here. Go ahead, Vanda.
Well, the opioid epidemic that the United States is going through, and not just the United States, Canada as well, is really the biggest US drug epidemic ever in history. Some 500,000 people have died since the late 1990s as a result of the opioid epidemic. And it's an epidemic that started with the legal market. And in fact, it was fueled and set off by a legal market, prescription opioids. And it was precisely the fact that you had a legal market with very powerful industry, the pharmaceutical industry, key companies such as Purdue Pharma, that managed to capture essentially the entire regulatory system, whether it was hiring away Drug Enforcement Administration agents, whether it was sponsoring members of Congress to allow for particular permissive law, whether it was giving money to medical boards. Every single agency that was supposed to protect US customers ended up one way or another co-opted by big pharma promoting prescription opioids. The result was massive overprescription and a drug epidemic that an illegal market would never be able to set off on a similar scale. When it finally became apparent just how many people were afflicted by opioid use disorder as a result of overprescription of opioids, tougher measures came in, more regulation came in. Some companies, the biggest villain here, Purdue Pharma, would stop sending sales representatives to doctors' offices, for example. So in about 2015, that was the year where opioid prescriptions in the United States peaked, just 5 years ago. But nonetheless, even when this curtailment of writing potent opioids that companies claimed were not addictive, but were in fact massively addictive, started taking place, you had many people who were addicted. So they went to look for an illegal supply to feed their habit, their use disorder. In the first instance, this was heroin that large Mexican drug trafficking organizations, Sinaloa Cartel, for example, rapidly switched into, and that gave a boost to poppy cultivation in Mexico, as well as a set of innovations in processing, going away from the black tar, very low quality heroin that traditionally has been produced in Mexico, moving toward much more potent white powder. Eventually, however, a third phase emerged with synthetic opioids, such as fentanyl, carfentanil, and other analogs being sourced from India and increasingly China, came to flood the US market. And when this happened, this really gave rise to big overdose, and the death rate significantly increased. Now, so today, people in the United States still continue to suffer from prescription opioid abuse and die of prescription opioids. That hasn't gone away. That old original problem hasn't disappeared, but now by far the biggest source of death is synthetic opioids, many of which are smuggled through Mexico by the same Mexican cartels, Sinaloa, Jalisco Nueva Generación, in particularly. So it was a legal drug market that set off the biggest epidemic and spawned illegal markets around the globe. And just this year with COVID appears particularly bad. We have had several years, but each year the number of deaths is either record or close to record. And the data coming in from 2020 look particularly dismal, so nothing that has been resolved. My last comment, I mentioned that Canada is going through the same problem because Canada had also very permissive regime in writing prescription opioids. And yet their overdose deaths in places like Vancouver are on par with the United States, even though Canada has a much less punitive system. And for example, Vancouver is well known for its harm reduction measures. Well, the harm reduction policies and measures were in no way able to cope with the legal supply and what it set off. So that alone was not sufficient to cope with this unrestrained, badly regulated or not regulated legal supply.
Thank you, Vanda. This is important because it's not only about cannabis. I mean, the problems and the drug trade between Mexico and the US and opioids is a big part of the picture. So let me, I mean, there's quite a few questions out there. So let me share with you something and see who want to address this. I mean, the first one is how much should the state be involved? How much they should push back at the local level, how much should be a local level effort. What happens with conservatives once, what is their reaction, and how will legal cannabis impact US-Mexico trade? I believe is drug trade. So Catalina, Emilio, you want to take one of these questions? Yes.
I'll say something which also addresses Emilio's point about corruption, I think. It is true that Mexico has a more, there's more corruption in Mexico, at least openly and in smaller, day-to-day contacts than there is in the US. But I think there's 2 points there, and it goes to the first question that Rafael was making. I think one of the points is starting out, which is something also that Tania, I know, and we from CIDE, we've also proposed starting with a more restrictive model and not a more open model, because we can always start opening up as we go along. But what if you create like something that's very open and very easily accessible, it's very difficult to restrict afterwards. So I think that's one of the things. Given corruption and given the fact, the risks that there are and the things that we don't know, we propose to start by a more restrictive model. And there's also a point that I wanted to make from what you said earlier about having one national regulation instead of different states. It's much easier, and we saw it, and we're seeing it in Mexico, to corrupt, and for big pharma to buy out senators and congressmen and have one big legislation which defends their interest. Whereas if you have, 32 different regulations, it's much more difficult and you can have a lot more experimentation. So that was just to push back. I think maybe states should have the ability and the possibilities of experimenting, and it would be a lot more difficult for big pharma to buy out each one of those instead of just having one national regulation.
And to address the other half of the question, I think it would increase trade between California and Mexico, the US and Mexico, a lot. you know, because we have a lot of experience now, you know, folks like Josh, a lot of technology, a lot of knowledge, a lot of processes, a lot of devices and the like. So I do think that the trade, it would ramp up. And somebody, so I was reading the questions, talked about a, you know, kind of like a NAFTA or whatever of cannabis. Difficult, but not impossible. You know, obviously Canada, and then I anticipate that the US will federally legalize. This is just me personally, in the next administration. I think whomever wins, cannabis will be legal, because it's already legal in about almost 40 states out of the 50 states. So that train just has left the station. It's kind of a little bit similar to the debates we were going through with gay marriage, right? Of where people were like really opposed, and then once it became like legal in a bunch of states, the state Supreme Court just completely, you know, gave a favorable decision, and now it's a non-issue, right? So I see, and again, I don't mean to be disrespectful or anything like that. It's just a comparison of the legal framework, right? That once states have decided we accept this, whatever the thing is, you know, politicians and even courts tend to just, you know, give it a thumbs up. And so I think, you know, we will see at the federal level, you know, more legalization now. And then that would, you know, if Mexico has legalization, that could see an influx in trade. So.
Thank you, Emilio. Josh, would you like to comment something? Josh, I wanted to ask you, I mean, if I were Santa Claus or if I were God, I mean, what are the 3 things that you would require for your business to boom?
For me, I would say, I wrote those down. So I would say, you know, like Emilio said, clear, fair regulations and taxes. Thing that we haven't discussed is California taxes does drive the black market. The taxes are not on city levels, but on the state level are just, I think, a lot higher, the excise tax. And it's kind of like, hey, we're going to legalize this, but we're going to tax you 51%. That doesn't drive for a healthy legalization market. So one of them would be clear, fair regulations and taxes.
Could you give us numbers, because we don't really have an idea of what the taxes are?
Sure. So, I mean, on a cultivation side, you're not affected as bad. From a cultivation side, every pound that we grow, we pay basically $153 roughly, don't quote me, within $153 of taxes for every pound of cannabis. And then for every pound of shake, which is the trim leaves, the excess, which is still used to manufacture, you know, lotions and creams and edibles. We are taxed $49 and some change on that. But then when our product, let's say, goes to a store and we sell it in an eighth quantity, we sell it at $30 wholesale. They turn around and have to charge a 15% tax as soon as they take it in. Then they get charged an excise tax. So by the time that they're taking that product in, something that they pay $30 for, they're already at almost $40 in taxes. And that's not including sales tax. So by the time an item leaves a retail store, it's been marked up almost 45 to 51% in taxes, depending on the city. So a lot of people, you know, they don't like paying the taxes, and that's a high priced, you know, and there's people that, you know, need medication, or they choose to smoke on a certain frequency. And that's what drives the black market is I can get, you know, four eighths for the price of 2 on a legal market. So tax wise, the retailer, and also not only just the taxes, but on the retail side, they have what is called a 280E, which does not allow retail to write off any labor, you can write off rent, but you can't write off anything that actually touches cannabis. So all your labor can't be written off. So you're not really making any profit on a retail level at this current moment. That's why you see a lot of big corporations coming in and buying retails, because when they change that 280E law, which they will when they federally legalize it, retail will be a huge moneymaker. So that's why right now you see a lot more Canada money coming into California, they're buying retails. They're not buying cultivations, even though cultivation is the most profitable part of the cannabis market in California. Most big corporates are buying retail because they want to have, you know, a big market share on the limited retail licenses that are going to be given out in state to state to state.
Thank you, Josh.
Rafael, can I come in here with an addition? This conversation that Josh raised is very important. And of course, one of the motivations for many to legalize drug markets in general, or particularly cannabis market, is the argument that this will generate substantial profits for state budgets. Of course, for state revenues to be significant, taxes have to be high. Otherwise, we are just talking about a simple agricultural commodity that's never going to be generated significant taxes. So the higher the taxes, in order to accomplish generating the promise of supplementing or fixing big budget holes, the greater the incentives not to declare and to evade taxes, a massive problem in Mexico. But at the same time, even with those high taxes, as far as I know, and I'm relying here on work of eminent people like Bo Kilmer and Keith Humphreys, there is not one single US state where legalization produced the financial revenues for states that they had imagined and expected. In every single of US jurisdictions, state level jurisdictions, the profits came much lower than what was hoped for, despite high taxes. And one reason, of course, why that is because legal production brings down prices by a lot. It's the illegality that keeps prices so artificially high.
Thank you, Vanda. There's a question there, Catalina, for you, Catalina and Tania, and this is, I mean, what is going to be the reaction of the Mexican conservative states to this legalization, of this movement of legalization of cannabis? Do you think any pushback from those states? Well, perhaps I could say Guanajuato, that has been in some gender issues particularly conservative. Catalina, Tania?
Yes, in terms of public opinion, it has been a slowly and long way also to try to provide information and to change the public opinion. So 10 years ago, the opposition or the positions against cannabis legalization for personal purposes was the proportion was really extreme. I mean, like 20% in favor and the rest 80% against. Nowadays, we are basically in the same level against and in favor, 45%. So the acceptation is now like a big. Nevertheless, yes, the conservative side still with this opposition, and that's why I think it was very important to go through the tribunals and to go to the courts in order to do this mandatory, because I mean, in other way, maybe trying to push this only through the legislative branch, taking into account that this conservative side have a representation and big representation in some states, it could be more difficult. But nowadays it's like mandatory, there's no option, and of course we have to stay working on provide information about what is this about, as it happened with other topics. And it is important to mention that also one thing that helps to increase the support is the cannabis, medicinal cannabis discussion. The cannabis, medicinal cannabis law was approved in 2017. So the discussion is more open now, and they're more like willing to change in the public opinion. But it is a battle that we have to keep working on, that providing information and public debate.
I would add something about that. So if we do have a federal regulation that allows for states maybe to have different licenses for dispensaries, one of the proposals was to have each state choose the licenses that they would give out. And if they wouldn't give out any licenses, then you could have the federal government put a dispensary in that state. But I think that's something that you could play around with. The other question is about, there's different ways to access legal cannabis. And one of them is the dispensaries. Another one is to have, as in Spain, the cannabis clubs, where people get together and grow together for their own benefit. And the other is home growing. And one of the things that, for me at least, has been very interesting is how not only in Mexico, but across all of Latin America, the pharmaceutical companies have been very much against having homegrown cannabis. And I think that's something interesting. And in the case of the conservative states, well, you could play around with these different models. And just a last point that I would make about the opinion of the people in Mexico. When you ask people, do you want recreational marijuana to be sold in your state? A lot of people say no. But when you ask them, do you want people who use and buy cannabis to be put in prison? They also say no. So I think there's, nuances there that we need to understand about how and what people really think about cannabis use. And also the last thing, Emilio started talking about the history of cannabis regulation in California and how it started with medical marijuana, which was not pharmaceutical, but a larger concept of, or more vast concept of what medical meant. And I think, some of these states could start with something like that.
Thank you, Catalina. Well, we should be wrapping up. I will ask you, each one of you, to have a last comment. The U.S. is facing a very important election this coming November 3rd. And do you think, Emilio and Vanda, that who wins will affect the legalization of cannabis, will affect the opioid crisis in the U.S., which is, do you see a big difference between the two candidates? And then let me just give the floor to each one of you to say your final comments. And this is about, lessons from California, what is California offering to Mexico? And so why don't we start with you, Vanda? What is your take on the coming election? If we have a second Trump administration, how would that be different with a Biden administration regarding legalization of cannabis in the U.S. and especially how you see that playing with Mexico and the drug problems between Mexico and the U.S.?
Well, Emilio is already on the record saying, regardless of whether it's Vice President Biden or President Trump who will win the elections, federal level will legalize. I certainly believe that with either administration, there is no prospect for any kind of retrogression, of moving away to trying to restrict this market. With respect to opioids, I am certainly very hopeful that the Biden administration would do much better than the Trump administration that has some accomplishments building on the Obama administration. The Trump administration did manage to get China to prohibit all fentanyl class drugs. That is very important, and we are yet to see how diligently China enforces that regulation. Of course, China and the US stand on the precipice of a new Cold War. The relations are as bad as they have not been in decades. And that leaves in my mind questions about whether China will be motivated to enforce diligently. For both Trump administration too, or Biden administration, dealing with Mexico will be very significant. The López Obrador administration has been very negligent in responding to the fentanyl crisis, in helping act against fentanyl smuggling through Mexico. There's been very little paucity of interest and cooperation that is really not excusable. particularly as the political consequences and violence consequences are much smaller than something like eradication of poppy crops. Mexico also is starting to develop its own fentanyl problems. They are very prominent in Tijuana, but will eventually spread throughout much of Mexico. And so there are good public health reasons for Mexico to act against fentanyl production, which is taking place in Mexico, and against fentanyl smuggling. But I would like to sort of add or end my comments here on the issue of what legalization of cannabis would mean in terms of violence for Mexico. And I agree with Catalina that it can have quite pronounced effect on the violence that the state imposes against users whom it imprisons. And that's a very beneficial outcome. I am very skeptical that it will in any way change the broader patterns of violence that, in my view, are principally driven by a catastrophic, hollowed out collapse of law enforcement in Mexico, a problem that's been going on for decades and that has not been resolved. It's this weak deterrence capacity where criminals can get away with any kind of murder, including shooting up the Secretary of Public Security in Lomas in Mexico City. That is at the core of why violence is so prominent. And a lot of the violence is, of course, about legal markets in Mexico. It's not about just cocaine or just fentanyl, but it's about avocado that was mentioned. It's about extortion of legal businesses. It's about extortion of OXXO. So, you know, there might be good reasons to legalize cannabis, but I am not at all hopeful that it will result in any kind of improvements in violence and that other issues at stake that Rafael, you and I and others have worked on have to take place for violence to come down.
Thank you, Vanda. This is very good. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your knowledge and your experience with us. Emilio.
Yeah. So to address your question, I don't think, again, this is just, let me disclaimer, this is just me personally, my own personal opinions on this question, not me as in my official capacity, okay? So with that disclaimer, I think either administration will legalize. I just think the money's too good. I mean, you have like former speaker John Boehner joining the board of a cannabis, you know, business and things like that, right? So I think that will happen. But I think where the big difference will be is, and that touches a little bit of what you hinted, Rafael, about potential, you know, what some folks perceive as corruption within the Trump administration and things like that, right? We know that if Trump were to, President Trump were to win a second term, I think you would see a very different legal framework, regulatory framework of how cannabis is legalized. It would be, in my opinion, skewed towards big business, big, you know, corporations and, you know, profits. And I think the administration and their appointees would be pushing the rules to the limits, the way they've been doing in many issues, right? And some people think that might be a little bit corrupt. And so anyway, we've seen California, as you know, many of you know, has been at the forefront fighting the Trump administration in many areas, whether it's healthcare, immigration, and the like. And I think this area would be perhaps no different. But under a Biden administration, again, in my opinion, I think you would see more of an emphasis of equity, what we've been talking about, right? So how do we find a balance so that we don't end up, right, the way perhaps corn is today with the big, you know, pharma in you know, states like Nebraska and, you know, and things like that, and farm subsidies to big mega farmers and things like that, right? I think particularly, you know, potential Vice President Kamala Harris is from Oakland. So again, you know, I think there is a bit of more of an awareness there as to the equity and some of the issues that ought to be included in a potential federal legalization of that. So I think that's my opinion on the matter that you asked.
Thank you, Emilio. Your last words. I mean, if you were Attorney General of Mexico, do you have any hesitance about legalizing drugs in Mexico, not only cannabis?
You know, I don't think I know enough about, you know, the other drugs, but I do think, and again, this is just my own personal opinion, okay? That is always subject to change as I learn and I'm educated by folks such as our wonderful panelists here. I do think that largely the war on drugs has been a failure on both sides, you know, of the US and Mexico. I mean, it's led to a lot of, I mean, in my opinion, from where I read and what I've seen, you know, the Mexican cartels are stronger than they've been. And so on that alone, based on a pure economical calculation, if you spend way more money and the cartels just keep getting stronger, it's been an abysmal failure. So on that, at that level, perhaps it is better to at least start, and I like what I believe Catalina or Tania, I forgot who said it. No, it was Catalina, I just remember. Maybe start with baby steps, right? Maybe you may be tempted to legalize all drugs. Well, maybe start with medicinal cannabis, right? And see how that takes off. And then you can continue, right, your way. The fact, I believe the studies that I've read is that, you know, the Mexican cartels, they're not really that much into cannabis. It's more of the synthetic, you know, drugs now. So I don't know if legalizing cannabis would have that much of an effect on them. If anything, it could be argued that it could have the opposite effect, meaning they have the capital to be able to enter into this now legal businesses, and then money laundering and things like that takes, you know, would take on a life of its own, right? Because that's how you would be able to get into like legal businesses, right? And so on and so forth. So I don't know, it's hard to say, but I do think that something needs to be done. And I think baby steps, perhaps starting with cannabis, could be a good test to see if, you know, and you decriminalize that, and at least, you know, we address some of the issues that they were saying, the 65% of the, you know, people who are being charged, and you could have your police and your resources be elsewhere.
Thank you, Emilio. You're a very good politico and also a wonderful public servant, public official. Josh, what will be your advice to Mexican producers, assuming that Mexico will legalize cannabis this year?
I would say, like Emilio said, you know, keep an open mind, being able to evolve with the industry that you're about to legalize is going to be the biggest thing. Is that and tax and regulate appropriately to not only discourage the black market but encourage legalization and other other small farmers, to allow them to get in with the social equity. I think is what they could, you know, really use.
Thank you, Josh, and thank you for sharing your thoughts with us and your experience. We know you're going through a lot because you lost your home and through the fires in California. So thank you for being with us. Catalina and Tania, your last remarks, your closing remarks. Thank you for being with us. You've been wonderful.
Well, I would just end by saying, you know, I think in Mexico, we really need to understand, and the US also, what it is to really move away from a punitive approach and into a health-based approach for drugs. And that question goes way beyond cannabis. It touches on the core of drug policy. And in the case of Mexico, it means thinking not about drugs just as a security problem, you know, in terms of what Vanda was saying, does it reduce violence or doesn't it reduce violence? But something, you know, much bigger, which is has to do with social justice and health issues. And I think there, you know, we have to think about, as I said before, harm reduction and the promotion and protection of human rights, how to obtain income for the states through taxes. And I think the US experience can give us a lot of insights on how to best achieve these goals. And there's some good examples and there's some bad examples. And I think, you know, they're there for studying and reaping. And thank you very much for the invitation of having me with these excellent panelists.
Thank you, Catalina. Tania.
Thank you. I cannot agree more with Catalina. This is a complex issue in Mexico, and we always try to emphasize that the cannabis regulation will not solve like all our problems of violence, but it is a problem about social justice, human rights, and public health. But if we take like the best model for Mexico, and just like with effective decriminalization, we can create huge impacts and benefits on our criminal justice system, and basically in justice and security agenda. So we need to include also decarceration mechanisms, social reintegration, derivation mechanisms, and others. So this is a huge challenge. Fortunately, we can count now with the experience of other latitudes, California, of course, but also with all the jurisdictions in the US and in other countries to do this in the best possible and gradual way that we can do. So thank you again. It has been really wonderful to be here.
Thank you very much, Tania. Well, before I thank you all, I mean, my takeaway will be that I will say that legalizing cannabis will not be the silver bullet to solve all the violence problems in Mexico, less so to solve all the justice problems that we have and social justice. But I will say I believe that we must legalize cannabis. What we have to do, and this is something I'm learning from you, Tania, and from you, Catalina, from you, Emilio, and Josh, in the right way. So hopefully it's, there's still time to improve that bill, because otherwise we're going to end up with an opening of the market, or a legalization of the market that might be too broad and not too adequate for our needs. So thanks a lot, Vanda. I mean, you're all over the place, and I really appreciate having you with us. And same wise, Emilio, Josh, Veal, Catalina, Pérez-Correa, and Tania Ramírez, wonderful to have you. We will send some takeaways, and let's keep in touch. This is, to be continued, because this is something that is going to be very present in the next few months and years, and this is one of the key issues in the coming, I will say, or in the near future of US-Mexican relations. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.